The title of today's talk is Vines, Wine and Our Unity in Jesus. And I just want to start out by in prayer, because I've just been very grateful for this organisation, and what its teachings and how it connects people. I'm by and large caught up in a shed down in McLaren Vale, all on my Pat Malone. And I've generally got my MP3 player in, so if you come into the winery at any point and you think I'm ignoring you, probably not. But it's been a very big blessing to me. So let's pray. Dad, thanks very much that we can come together. We can come together and learn about you. We can come together to know you through your Son and in the Spirit. We pray that you'll open our eyes tonight, open our palates, enthrall our minds, so that we can come into a clearer understanding of who you are and how much you love us. In your precious name, amen. So to start, I just want to read a passage which I accidentally stumbled upon in Isaiah 46 verse 4, and I'm reading out of the NIV. Even to your old age and grey hairs, I am he who will sustain you. I have made you and I will carry you. I will sustain you and I will rescue you. I love that. My name's Adrian Kenny and I'm a winemaker in McLaren Vale. I'm the father of 2 children, and my wonderful wife is very patient with me when I work vintage. I get to make wines in a little shed overlooking most of McLaren Vale. It's a spectacular view. And if you're ever down in the district, please feel free to call in and say g'day. What I wanted to discuss tonight was what it means to think about who we are as believers in Christ, who we are as part of the human race, and who the Trinity are, and how that relates to our workplace, how what we know as who we are relates in and through and by us into our workplace, and how it affects us. I'm very fortunate I have a creative job on one hand and a scientific job on the other. So my scientific training teaches me how to analyse wines, how to check them for their structure and their integrity. And on the other hand, I get to be quite creative and in crafting the wines into a flavour that I find before the wines. When I'm out in the vineyard walking through, we're chewing plenty of fruit, and during vintage, or before vintage, you generally end up with a lot of guts aches from eating so much fruit out in the vineyard. And so you taste the fruit on the vine, and when you're tasting at that point, you clearly understand what the final wine is going to taste like. You have a flavour map in your mind, so to speak. So to look at this painting here on the wall, the artist will generally have an idea in their mind of what the final picture might look like. Or if you're doing a portrait, you'll try and have the picture look like the person that you're painting the portrait of. And so it is with winemaking, except that mine's a flavour, it's aroma, and it's a texture. And so what I'm looking to convey into the final wine is what I see in the vineyard. Now, where can we start? Do you want a lectern? No, that'll be all right, mate. I've learned at least one thing in the recent times, and that is to let Jesus teach you about his dad. Let him teach me about my dad. As I said, I'm caught in a shed by myself most of the time, and I find my mind very easily spins off into many different regions, and especially when I'm tired, I just get so drawn down, and during vintage, which is I find myself sleeping at the winery, and I'm away from my family who are not even a kilometre away, and I'm physically exhausted, I'm emotionally exhausted, I just want to go for a holiday, and yet the grapes still keep on coming in. And so I find myself in a really dark place at that point, and I keep on thinking back to what I think about myself. And most of you, I'm sure, don't do this, but you start to get depressed. Oh, you're such an idiot, mate. You've messed that up again, and so forth and so forth. And I keep on coming back to in the start of Ephesians, where we find out who we are. So I just want to start there tonight. If we can I know a lot of you know this passage really well. I'm reading out of the Message. I find this a tremendous encouragement to me in those times. I am Paul, under God's plan as an apostle, a very special agent of Jesus Christ, writing to you, faithful believers in Ephesus. I greet you with the grace and peace poured into our lives by God, our Master and Father, Jesus Christ. How blessed is God, and what a blessing He is. He's the Father of our Master, Jesus Christ, and takes us up to the highest places in blessing in Him. Long before He laid down the earth's foundations, He had us in mind and settled on us as the focus of His love, to be made whole and holy by His love. Long, long ago He decided to adopt us into His family through Jesus Christ, and what pleasure He took in planning this. He wanted us to enter into the celebration of His lavish gift-giving by the hand of His beloved Son. Because of the sacrifice of the Messiah, His blood poured out on an altar of the cross, we are a free people, free of penalties and punishments chalked up by all our misdeeds, and not barely free either, abundantly free. He thought of everything, provided for everything we could possibly need, letting us in on the plans He took such delight in making. He set all of us out before us in Christ, a long-range plan in which everything will be brought together and summed up in Him. Everything in deepest heaven, everything on planet Earth. It's in Christ that we find out who we are and what we are living for. Long before we first heard of Christ and got our hopes up, He had His eye on us. He had designs for us, for glorious living. Part of His overall purpose He has worked out in everything and everyone. Paul's clearly delusional here. Thanks, I'm glad I'm not the only one who thinks that. He says that in Jesus we find out who we are and why we're here. But hang on a sec, I'm the authority on who I am. You know, it's pretty easy for me to take a look inside and see that gaping black hole and sort of looks like squid guts all mushed up. And just maybe, I need to let Jesus tell me about who I am in His Dad. And it's that unity, it's that inness, that oneness that I want to grapple with a little bit tonight, and that's why we'll be looking at three wines. Unity with distinction. So that is not to say that we are part of a one. So Baxter uses an analogy of a glass of water dropped into the Murray River where it just merges into the oneness. I want to show that we're part of that oneness, part of that unity, but with distinction. And so also we look back at the gospel where Paul is saying that Christ took great pleasure in planning us to come into that oneness before the creation of the world. So it's the same as when I walk out in the vineyard, I'm tasting out through the vines, and tasting all the berries and trying to think of, okay, well, I need a bit of that patch over there, I need that patch over there for the final wine, and always thinking of the person who's going to drink it at the end. So I'd also like to start a little more by going into the vineyard. Let's walk out into the vineyard with a master vigneron. If we can look at the start of in John 15, the vine and the branches. Typically, it describes the father there as being the husband of the vineyard or the farmer. I would like to suggest maybe that the father is a vigneron. Someone who tends the vines, looked after the vines, but also is in keeping of making the wine as well. So we'll just read the start of in John 15, and once again I'm reading from the Message. I am the real vine, and my Father is the vigneron. He cuts off every branch in me that doesn't bear grapes. Every branch that is grape-bearing, He prunes it back so that it will bear even more. You have already been pruned back by the message I have spoken. Live in me, make your home in me just as I do you. In the same way that a branch can't bear grapes by itself, but only being joined in the vine, you can't bear fruit unless you're joined with me. I am the vine, you are the branches. When you're joined with me and I in you, the relation intimate and organic, the harvest is sure to be abundant. Separated, you can't produce a thing. But anyone who separates from me is dead wood, gathered up and thrown on the bonfire. But if you make yourselves at home with me, and my words are at home in you, you can be sure that whatever you ask will be listened to and acted upon. This is how my Father shows who he is. When you produce grapes, when you mature as my disciples, I've loved you the way the Father has loved me. Make yourselves at home in my love. If you keep my commands, you'll remain intimately at home in my love. That's what I've done. I've kept my Father's commands and made myself at home in his love. I've told you these things for a purpose, that my joy might be your joy, and your joy wholly mature. This is my command, love one another the way I have loved you. This is the very best way to love. Put your life on the line for your friends. Your friends, when you do these things, I command you. I'm no longer calling you servants because servants don't understand what their master is thinking and what it's planning. No, I've named you friends because I've let you on everything I've heard from the Father. You didn't choose me, remember? I chose you and put you in the world to bear fruit, fruit that won't spoil. As fruit bearers, whatever you ask the Father in relation to me, he gives you. But remember the root command, love one another. So often we glance over these in statements. I know that I struggle to understand, have comprehension of what it actually means to be in Jesus. Does anyone find that? Does anyone find that these in statements, and especially when he says in chapter 14, verse 20, that you're in the Father and you're in me? I can't quite remember that quite exactly. But we struggle to understand what this unity actually means and how it comes about. And so it's quite interesting that in chapter 14, Philip says to Jesus, "Oh, well, if you show us the Father, then we can understand." And I sometimes wonder whether John records it that it's Philip because he was trying to get one back on Philip, or whether Philip had upset him one day. But Jesus says back to him, "So don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? These words that I speak to you aren't mere words. I don't just make them up on my own. The Father who crafts each word into divine act. Believe me, I am in my Father and my Father is in me. If you can't believe that, believe what you see, these works." So why can't we see that we're in Jesus and we're in the Father? One of the things that I find quite embarrassing is that I'm actually red-green colourblind. So in the Ishihara test here, I'm not sure if everyone can see that. You want to play a great practical joke on me, just hide some numbers in the red-green colourblind section of one of these, and I'm just done for. And so, in the first one here, I can see, well, that's a 25. I'm not blue-green colourblind. In this one, there's supposed to be buried a 45, which I'm glad you can see. That looks like a whole stack of dots. And so I know that I've got a blindness problem. To us, that's why the law was given, to know that we've actually got a blindness problem. But Jesus is not worried about us so much keeping a set of rules as he is to understand who he is, who his Father is, who the Spirit is, and who we are in that relationship. So he's not going to just leave it that we're blind. He's not going to just leave us being blind and uncured. So what he does is comes into our existence. Now, I'll just back up a little bit. I'm hoping we've got a viticulturalist here because I've got a vine that is not producing any fruit. And it's a good vine. It's Shiraz vine. It's 45 years. Years old. It should be producing some really great fruit. Anyone tell me why it's not producing some great fruit? I'd love to make wine from this vine, by the way. Yeah, that's the problem. It's dead. That one escaped me. What's happened here is a harvester has come along, and a machine harvester, and has knocked the branch off the vine. And because it's no longer attached to the vine, it's dead. And that's what Jesus is telling us here in chapter 15. If you're not joined to the rest of the vine, you're dead. You're just a piece of dried up wood. So if we have any sort of life in us and we're not dead, then there's actually a fair chance that we're joined to Jesus, because we can't have life outside of Jesus. Now, the reason why these vines are generally burnt, or the dead wood is generally burnt, is because they actually can harbour a lot of disease, pest and disease and these things. I'm just going to hand around some pictures, and Phil, if you can. Now, the one up in the top left is actually a picture of a stunted vine. So a vine that, if you can imagine, shoots growing off these, and you know how they get big long canes coming off them, and you'll find bunches of fruit growing off those canes. What happens with this disease called Eutypa is those branches become really stunted. They become constricted. And in the second picture, which is on the top right-hand corner, you'll see what's happening on the inside of the vine. So if we were to take a cross-section through here, you'll see that in a vine that had Eutypa, you'll see that there's actually dead wood starting to come into that vine. And so the vine can still produce fruit, and it can still produce really good fruit. It just can't produce much of it. And so what we see with Eutypa is I liken to obeying Jesus' commands. And what's the primary command he gives to us in chapter 15? It's to love one another and to remain in his love. And I love that picture where he says, "Make yourselves at home in my love." And every time we've got a little daughter, and her name's Philippa, and she's far too cute for my good. And she's 16 months old now, and you know what it's like. They're teething at that age, and if you don't, around that age, they're generally teething, and they can have some really bad days. And when they're having a bad day, everyone has a bad day. But when Pippa's sick and I cuddle her, she'll just nestle her head up under my neck here on my shoulder, and she'll there. And I love this. I pat her on the back, and then she starts patting my arm the same. And it's that making herself at home in the love that's obviously freely available to her. And this is what Jesus is asking us to do, is to make ourselves at home in the love that he's given us, in the life that he's given us. Now, there's another major pest that affects grapevines. And that's one that can actually kill a grapevine. You may have heard a little bit about it. It's a nasty, nasty little aphid-like bug called phylloxera. Now, if you go into wine growing regions, you'll see little stickers on the back of vehicles, and you'll see a little mite, and with a big cross through it, keep SA phylloxera free. And that is very, very important, because we've got a lot of vines or most of the vines inside of South Australia are what's called on their own roots. So that is, if I was to strike a cutting off one of the vines, then I'd put it into the ground, and the roots would grow off it, and then that would turn into its own grapevine. Now, this little pest, this little aphid, will attack the roots, and will also attack the leaves, and it will just suck the life out of the vine. Now, the vines can still produce fruit for a number of years, and they just wither and wither and wither. And so, but eventually they die. One thing that I really like in the phylloxera and what Jesus has done, not only for us, but into us, is you'll see the third picture there on the underneath on the middle left, and it's grafted. So the way phylloxera was got around to, we were able to beat phylloxera, apart from keeping it out of South Australia, but also in other regions around the world, because phylloxera just about decimated all of Europe. So there's a lot of vines in Australia that are actually much older than the vines in France. The French don't like us talking about that too much, but you Australians, what do you know how to make wine? But the vines have been grafted, and they've been grafted onto a phylloxera-free rootstock. So left to their own devices, without being grafted on, these vines will die. And so what's happened is that the grafted rootstock, which is resistant to the phylloxera, which incidentally both pests actually come from North America, both the pest and the cure for it, which is the grafted rootstock, we get grafted into, and so then the vines can produce their fruit. So left to their own devices in a phylloxera region, these vines are going to die. Grafted into phylloxera-free rootstock, then they're able to live, and not just live, but thrive. Now, the important thing is that it's not just, as David Qualick would say, it's not just what we're being saved from, but it's what we're being saved into. So it's not just that we're being saved from something that's going to kill us, phylloxera, it's that we're being saved into union with Jesus. And not just union to grow healthy plants, because what vineyard owner really wants a bunch of healthy plants that doesn't produce anything? And so the goal is to not only be in and be healthy, but also to produce the fruit. I love my kids dearly, and I love Pippa's hugs, and I love Jack. Jack's 4.5 now. And each morning and each night and most other opportunities he comes and gives me a great big hug. And what I love about that hug is, as J.B. Torrance puts it, it's a definition of our salvation, a prospective and retrospective acts of salvation. So that is the first part of the hug, and I really hope I get this somewhere even close. The first part of the hug is an opening up. So that is, God opens himself up to us. And then the second part of the hug is the closing arms, the drawing in, drawing us to himself. And so the two parts of the salvation. First, he cures the things that affect our very existence. He cures the sin that affects our very existence, as Athanasius says, for himself, so that we can come and be in him. And as Jesus says, that intimate relationship, intimate and organic relationship. And once again, why would he do this? What's the fruit out of all this? Well, the fruit, let me come back to the wine a little more. Let me start off by my first wine tasting venture. So back in Western Australia, Jo, my wonderful wife, and I went to this. We went to this TAFE course, and so we were learning about wine and all the correct things to say and all the characteristics to look for. And she said one of the most important things is the complexity of the wine. So if you're out wine tasting, and whoever mentions complexity first, they've won the wine tasting. It's not supposed to be a challenge, and you always find that people want to make it so. But whoever mentions complexity, it's about the complexity. There are no two berries in any vineyard that are exactly the same. There are some that are going to be very similar, but they're going to be very different. Now, there are a number of things that make them different. For example, the soil that the vine's actually in, the amount of water that it's received, how it's trellised. That is, are they bush vines that grow up from the ground like that, or are they hold on to wires? And you'll see a lot of wires and posts in vineyards, and so that they can support the vines. Which way are they orientated? Are they orientated north-south, or are they orientated east-west? And so, and then you take a bunch of berries. Where are they on the bunch? So each bunch of berries is so subtly different. Now, the great thing about vineyards is that typically you will have a vineyard that has a number of different variations in the soil underneath the ground. There are just a number of bits of variation throughout the vineyard. The great thing from a winemaking perspective is that the more variation that you get within a vineyard, the more interesting the wine is. So that if you had a big homogeneous planting and all the berries all looked the same, then it's very easy to end up with a pretty simple and boring wine. The more, and this is once again just looking within one vineyard of one variety. So we might be talking about Shiraz, or we might be talking about Cabernet. So one variety. So the more complexity and the more variation that we see in it, the more interesting the wine is. And so you'll see on the next two pictures on the thing there, or the bottom two pictures, or actually the third picture, the one on the right-hand side, for the most part of history, you'll see that gnarly old bush with the sunset in the background. The most part of history, that's what vines have looked like. So that's what we refer to as a bush vine. So if you see an old bush vine Grenache, that's what the vine will look like. So it's unsupported, untrellised, and the vines are, you've got to love these vines. I mean, they're hard work, but they generally give you great fruit. They'll generally be like this sort of arrangement. So you'll have like a candelabra sort of arrangement, and out the top of each spur here, you'll get a couple of shoots come out. They're generally about a foot off the ground, so they're generally about that low to the ground. And so most of the work that you do to these vines is all down at bootlace level, pruning, picking and everything, and consequently we don't find many people who actually really want to do that. So if we have anyone that really wants to do some picking during vintage in the 40-degree heat, come down and see us. We'd be great to have you. Now, one of the very interesting things to see between the other two pictures that you see there on the bottom, and I'm sorry we haven't got more copies to hand around, we'll see the one, we see what looks like a very pristine long line of ones and a bit of haze. That's called vertical shoot positioned trellising. Now, and you notice the wires holding everything up nicely. I sometimes liken this to how the Spirit supports us and how He holds us up. That is, the vines are nicely pruned when the Father comes through and prunes the vines, opens the canopy right up, and so that we get plenty of airflow through the canopy, beautifully supported by these wires and trellising. Then you'll see the other picture, which just looks like a hodgepodge. That's called minimally pruned. So what generally happens is you get a machine that will come down and hedge these vines, and that's about all the love they get for pruning. And so consequently what happens between these two types of trellising system is, they're both up on a wire, so they both have a wire supporting the cordon, so the two branches, but the minimally pruned ones generally are quite gnarled. You've got a 40 centimetre wide hedge, and inside that hedge there is a lot of dead wood that harbours a lot of disease, harping back to the eutypa. These vines generally have a lot of eutypa in them, and so what typically happens is they don't generally yield very good fruit. But not only that, they generally harbour a lot of disease, because when they come along with the spray isn't able to penetrate all the way into the canopy, because you've got a lot of stuff there that's blocking it getting in. Now, I don't have a direct analogy to how this might play out in our lives. I suspect one or two other people here might have good analogies to why vines that are gnarled or not pruned well aren't able to produce as good a fruit as the ones that have been well and truly maintained and looked after. So if you feel free to share those with me later on, or share those with the group, there'll be time for discussion a little bit later on. Now, we're going to hop into some wine tasting very, very shortly. And just before we start that, I just want you to remember that these wines are of high alcohol, encourage you to drink plenty of water and to expectorate or spit regularly. Now, when we're tasting wines, it's quite interesting. What we're looking for is, or what I've come to discover is, what I look for in a wine now is a Trinitarian balance. Couldn't come up with any better term, I'm afraid. But a Trinitarian balance. So what I'm looking for is the three major components, which is aroma, flavour and texture. So aroma, obviously how it smells. flavour, which is how it tastes, and texture, which is a difficult one to wrap your head around. It's difficult even for a lot of winemakers to agree on. But texture is how it feels inside of your mouth. How does it affect the inside of your mouth? That is, if you've got a wine that's quite tannic, how does it dry? It dries your mouth out. So if you've ever had a young Cabernet Sauvignon, you drink it and there's a lot of tannin in it, and your mouth will really suck in like this. And that's because the tannin dries your mouth out and dries your mouth closed. And you'll find that it dries up the saliva inside your mouth quite quickly, and it's quite raspy on the roof of your mouth. Whereas a young voluptuous Shiraz, for example, is a lot less, or even a Grenache has a lot less tannin in it, and so you'll find it'll be quite smooth and gentle inside of your mouth. So that's texture, how it affects and how it feels inside of your mouth. So when we start looking at these wines after the break, we're looking at how the wines affect your mouth. Now, there's also another really groovy wine term to get out in conversation. So I'm just looking at the retronasal characteristics of this wine, and I find it to be quite pleasant, and there's quite a bacony, toasty character. So how you do the retronasal character thing is when you've taken a little bit of wine into your mouth and swirled it around, do the cappuccino noise of sucking air through it, and expectorated it, of course, or swallowed it, taking it in. Then you breathe out, close your mouth and breathe out through your nose. Now, what that does is what you're able to pick up there is a lot of the heavier volatiles. So that is the aromas, aromatic compounds that are quite heavy, actually come down into your throat, and when you breathe them out, you pick them up in a different part of your nasal passage that is able to determine those. So that's the retronasal characteristic. Now, one of the other questions we get asked quite regularly is, why do you take air through the wine? Why do you do the cappuccino noise through the wine? The sucking air through the wine helps release those volatile characteristics, and what typically happens is that you're able to get a lot of aroma actually coming through that. So you, instead of sticking your nose in the glass and smelling it there, you're actually able to pick up a lot of aromatic compounds and a lot of the aromatics through sucking air through the wine. Once again, take practice. It's pretty embarrassing when it out of your mouth onto your boots. I've had that happen many times. So I guess we'll have a bit of a break now, and is that okay? Yeah. And when we resume, once again, if you're going to have tea and coffee, wash it down with plenty of water afterwards. Tea and coffee has quite a lot of bittering compounds, and so will inhibit the appreciation of some of the bittering compounds in the wine. And tea has a lot of tannin in it and can mask some of the tannin compounds in the wine as well. Sorry, is there any questions? No? Okay. All right, we'll have a break now. Yes?
When you're doing the vintage,
yes?
I understood that you swallowed the grapes. Why don't you spit them out?
That's a great question. The question was, when out in the vineyard, why do you not spit the grapes out? When they're green, you do. But when they're ripe, they taste pretty good, and it's pretty hard to spit out. And so, you know, everyone does it, and even really experienced people just accept that you're going to end up with a guts ache for about 4 weeks of the year. It's really embarrassing, but it happens. And stained teeth too. You end up with really black stained teeth, especially tasting reds. Excellent. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Thanks. We'll have a break, and as I said, please have plenty of water. There'll be water on the tables as well.
And during the break, Sandy and Michelle are selling books and CDs. They're going to head off afterwards, so if you want to buy something, please do it during the break, so it won't be available afterwards. And afterwards, you want people to come back to the table or back to the
Oh, sorry, yeah, take a seat and grab the glasses, and we'll sit down and we'll take a look at those.
So we'll have a break for about 10 minutes. Thanks.
You go into a winery at a cellar door where they've got cheese platters on the cellar door, it generally means they're selling some pretty rough reds. What cheese does is it's big globular fat proteins, and if you've got young tannic wines, they'll bond it and they'll actually make it look like they're really good reds. So come up to my winery, I've got plenty of cheese in the fridge. So anyway, getting back to the Grenache, I just want to talk about the Grenache again very briefly. The Grenache is just a lovely, beautiful wine. At the start of vintage, when this fruit came in, it was in poor condition. It had a lot of table grapes in it, which just dilute the flavour. And so, being a bloke caught in the shed on his own, I just had no one else to talk to. So I said, "Lord, what am I going to do with this? I've got to make good wine for this client. Make good wine out of this Grenache." And I just felt him say, "Throw a bit of Viognier in it." Now, for those of you that don't know about Viognier being a white grape, you would naturally think, well, that's going to dilute the colour even further. Why would you add white grapes to red grapes? But there's this wonderful phenomenon of co-pigmentation. Now, what co-pigmentation does is it actually means that you can add certain varieties of white grapes to some red grapes, and it makes the colour stronger. And it actually makes the flavours and aromas and textures stronger. Now, in this Grenache, it shows by obviously a little bit deeper colour, which you wouldn't otherwise be able to see unless you could see the Grenache straight on its own. But there's a sleekness, there's a velvet character right across the palate, and there's a fullness in the palate that this wine would not otherwise have. To have a Grenache from McLaren Vale typically is generally very jammy, very boiled confectionery characteristics. But the beautiful thing is with this is, like when Jesus came to the earth, he had that whole fermentation process with the human race. So in living out his life as he did, is like the Viognier being fermented with the red grapes. So what we could do is we could just add some white wine into some red wine, and that just dilutes the characteristics. There's that no, it doesn't go through that whole fermentation process. Now, the fermentation process, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a conversion of sugars to alcohol. And so we get some yeast that facilitate that process, and what the yeast do is they chew the sugar down, they expel CO2, and they also expel ethanol, which is alcohol. So that whole rugged fermentation process is actually quite a violent process where there's heaps of energy thrown off, and it takes around about 2 weeks to ferment the grapes, and sometimes it can take up to months and months and months. So some of my ferments are still going at the moment, many months after. But a process that is quite violent. So when and has heaps of energy in it. So Jesus came to the earth, came to be what we are, and so that the human race, us, could be part of the Trinitarian relationship, and that we are. And so forever, white grapes are changed. They're part of red wine. So these Viognier will never reach their full potential. No, that's not entirely true. It's actually really a beautiful part of this Grenache wine. So we'll move on now to the Shiraz. Now, this Shiraz is Kangaroo Island Shiraz, and I used an old world technique with it. I used what's called a carbonic maceration, or as the French would say, is a maceration carbonique. And what you Australians know about making wine. It's a really old characteristic, and if you've heard of Beaujolais, which is typically like a rosé, this has been made during that exact same process. So what it is fermentation without oxygen. So what I've done with this is I've sealed it up and fermented it without oxygen, and that's what gives it that rich, fruity characteristic. And this is my interpretation of a Beaujolais, so it's a lot deeper and gutsier as well. Now, the Tempranillo on the left-hand side is, let's have a look at that, because that's got some really dark fruit characteristics. Now, what I'm saying with that, and once again, this wine's quite closed.
Where does the pepper come from in the Kangaroo wine?
Oh, it's just the peppercorns growing up through the vineyard everywhere. No, not really. The pepper is actually... in Australia, we've got this great place called the Australian Wine Research Institute, AWRI, that just discovered these compounds, these pepper compounds, 2 years ago. They do some fantastic research here, and it's critically acclaimed worldwide, and it's one of the great research institutes across the world. And so this pepper characteristic is actually found in the grapes, and different fermentation characteristics will highlight that, this being one of them. So Adelaide Hills Shiraz will typically have a really fine ground white pepper smell to it, whereas McLaren Vale and Barossa will have like a fresh cracked black pepper smell. And so it's not till you sit all these wines in front of you and go and smell them all and go, you guys are idiots, what do you know? But and you know, your winemakers think too much about these wines, just enjoy them. But you start to pick up and be able to discern it. Now, interestingly enough, these wines, I'd made these wines in my mind before they were finished fermenting. So that is, I don't know how I can do this, but I could taste these wines, I could smell these wines before they'd finished fermenting. Now, Michael Polanyi calls that tacit knowledge. I think it's TF that calls it spiritual knowledge. So it's something inside us. It's a taste that we can taste before we can actually taste it. An expectation of something that's to come. And so now what we're going to do is I want you to try and roughly pour out 3 equal measures in your glass, and then I want you to blend them all into one glass. Because if we're to say that... Oh, sorry. Yep. Taste the Tempranillo. My apologies. Taste the Tempranillo. Get stuck into it. This is a really interesting wine. I haven't made too much Tempranillo before. It's quite a dark, and it's got... I'll describe the aroma of this wine as being a little bit tarry. So like if you can imagine a freshly sealed road, how you can smell the tar off it. It's got almost like a bit of a minty characteristic to it as well. And it smells like it's got some big fat Satsuma plums in it. Has anyone stolen any Satsuma plums off the neighbour's tree? Especially really ripe ones. It's got that sort of smell in it as well. Yes?
What's the mushroom aroma?
See, great question. What's the mushroom aroma in that? This is actually the mushroom characteristic aroma is a characteristic of this wine. That's what we would say well, you can call it as a mushroomy character. Mushrooms generally don't class as a very nice characteristic in the wine, but this is an earthy characteristic. Or we try and look for glamorous ways of saying characteristics for these wines. So, but we'd say that's an earthy or a forest floor type aroma in the wine.
This one, which is spicy, we said it smells like fermenting broad beans.
Oh, that's right.
I'm sorry.
But it does. You go back into it, you can smell it.
Who ferments broad beans? Lisa, please.
You can smell it.
Fermenting broad beans.
And you know the middle one, the fermented broad bean one, that's got a fizz on the tongue. It fizzes.
Because it's still going through malolactic fermentation. Barrel samples.
All right, that's why.
Yeah.
So it is fermenting.
Yeah. The second fermentation. So it's not the primary fermentation; it's a secondary fermentation.
Well, it's fizzing on the tongue.
We had someone pick up and said that the second wine, the Grenache, is apart from having a fermenting broad bean character. Thanks, Lisa. Oh, sorry, the Shiraz. My apologies. One of the wines was a little spritzy. Spritzy is a term to say that it's got a little bit of tingly on the palate. Now, that tingliness is actually due, in this case, to what's called second fermentation, or it's malolactic fermentation. So we've got malic acid, and we've got bacteria that comes along and chews up that malic acid and converts it to lactic acid, and the reason it does that is to stabilise the wine. So is everyone blended? Feel free now to blend the two wines. Who liked the Tempranillo? 3 wines, sorry, 2. Yep, got a couple of people that don't mind the Tempranillo. This Tempranillo will look good in 5 years. Give this one 5 more years to look good. What will happen over the 5 years is the wine will be glorified, and that is, we'll be able to see it for what it actually is. So what happens during that period is that the wine will start to open up, it will mature, and we'll be able to start to see that wine for the way it actually is. So all those chemical reactions, polymerisation, so that the wine will actually start to think. Yes?
If you have championships for wine,
Yes? Good question. There's many different categories for the wine shows, and so you can enter it now. So I can enter that wine into a show now, or I could wait 5 years. So there'll be different categories for both. So we invent categories for wines that we think that we'd like to win trophies for. That's one of the great things about the show circuit. So everyone's looked at those wines. What I'd encourage you to do now is, what I'm hoping that you're able to see in this wine now, or the cordials, is I'm hoping that you're able to see and smell and taste some of the differences, some of the things that you will remember that tasting in the individual wines that you'll be able to see in this wine. Now, the important part with this is the relational aspect between the components in these wines. So that is that you won't be able to see these wines the way that you saw them before. There's an interrelationship that happens between the wines so that different aromas are elevated, different aromas suppressed. You'll be able to taste some things and not others, and the overall mouthfeel of the wine has also altered. So taste the wine, discuss the wine, and if anyone's got any questions, shout out or sing out. But once again, try and look for those individual characteristics of the individual wines in the one wine. So what we're looking at now is unity with distinction. This is really important because, as Baxter says, if there's no distinction, then we're just merged into the Borg, to use his Star Trek analogy. We're part of the one with no distinction, or we're like a drop of water in a glass of water. So what we're looking at is trying to see the distinction of the individual wines in the one wine, because if there's no distinction in the individual wine, then we have no distinction within that Trinitarian relationship. So have a look, enjoy the wine, and see what you reckon of it, and see whether we should have this as a final blend. I actually haven't done this exercise with this wine yet.
We've lost the vegetable smell from this.
The vegetable. Oh, I know what it. Yep.
Has anyone ever done like wine tests with you where they've mixed together a few different wines and you've had to pick out what's in there? That would be pretty tricky.
I've got some really good mates in McLaren Vale, and the reason why they're mates is because what they'll do is they'll hand me a glass of wine and say, "What is it? Tell me all about this wine." And one of my great mates is actually an American, and he bought a whole stack of his wine over from America with him. So, but he also has a lot of French wine in his collection and some Italian wine as well, plus stuff that he's bought from Australia. So it could be just about from any country. Hand me a glass of wine, so what is it? Tell me the region, the alcohol variety, is it a blend, and fermentation techniques as well. So, and this is part of the training. As we know who we are in the Trinitarian relationship, who we are as persons, as what Jesus is talking to us about in John 14 and John 15, what he's trying to get us to see, and what the writers of the Gospels are trying to help us to see, that unity that we have. What they're trying to see is that's who we are. Now learn how to walk in it. Here's the wine. What do we taste in it? And what I taste in that wine today won't be the same as what I taste in it tomorrow, and not in the same as the next week. A couple of years ago, or before, I was just explaining that some of these, what you taste in this wine today won't be the same as what you taste in it next week, or the week after, or the week after that. The a couple of years ago, right before vintage, my life just sucked, basically. I was so wound up, I was so anxious, I was, in the previous years before that, in and out of depression, and had, for the most part, no idea that that's what it was. And I got to the point, I just can't handle it anymore. And right in the midst of that anxiety and that pain and that frustration, Jesus audibly said, "You're free." And anyone here could have told me I was free and gone, yeah, no worries, thanks. Yeah, I'm free. I read it in Ephesians. I'm abundantly free, yeah. And it wasn't until Jesus said, "Mate, you're free." And it's just I'm free. And I bawled. I sobbed uncontrollably for 45 minutes, and it was really embarrassing if you were to see from the outside. But what has come out of that is that I now know here I'm free. And every day is about learning to live in that freedom. We're united with Jesus. And what we're learning here, what our walk each day is how to learn to live in that unity. How we relate out of it. How I respond to my wife who says, "You should have been home 45 minutes ago. Your daughter's been screaming the entire time. What are you going to do?" How do I relate in that time? And so that relational characteristic, something that we can taste in the wine, we can taste and smell and see that, and how we learn how to taste and smell and see in this wine is exactly the same as what we do in our walk with the Trinity and in the Trinity. And so that's why I say that in a year's time, you won't look at a wine the same way. You won't be able to taste it the same way because you've changed. Your palate's changed. Your ability to be able to discern aromas have changed as you've possibly learned a bit more about wine or not. And so what I'm hoping to show you here is that as we look at various things like food, like wine, our work, what it means to participate in the life that we've got, how that changes as we learn to relate within that unity that we share. So that in that oneness, knowing that we've got our feet and that our life comes from Jesus, the vine. And what happens when we let the Father prune us back. The analogy that I was looking for, and thank you very much to the gentleman who shared, the analogy I was looking for between the minimally pruned vines and the really good vines is that letting God love us, letting the Father love us. We can look at those minimally pruned vines. Nope, I'm not going to let you love me, Lord. Nope. And we end up with a whole stack of clutter in our lives. And so the farmer's still going to love us. He's still going to apply the sprays, and he's still going to do all the diligent things that a vineyard or a farmer will do to look after his grapes the very best that he can. But it's really difficult to do. But he does it anyway because he loves his vines and he loves the fruit that comes from them. Whereas the pruned vines are just beautiful and open. And that's letting our Dad love us and come in and incise the dead wood out of our lives. Go in and prune so that we can be more fruitful, so that we don't have the disease in our lives, so that we can learn to live in that unity that we share in Jesus, the vine. So anyway, I'll stop gasbag and try the wine. Or have we got some people that like to talk about the wine, what they see in it? The aromas. We have one characteristic that says that vegetable, that fermenting broad bean character. Well, I'm never going to let that go. It's actually a vegetal character, and that greenness that some people may pick up actually comes from the stalks, a little bit of stalkiness, and I actually wanted that greenness there. That's okay.
I still have one more question.
Yeah, sure.
Why do you put the rose bushes at the end of a rose? Is it for the aphis?
Great question. For those who didn't hear it, why are rose bushes put at the end of the rose? One, because the farmer wants the vineyard to look pretty, but the reason why it was done in the past was an early monitoring system. And because the theory was that roses are actually more susceptible than grapevines to pest and disease. And the pest and disease being powdery mildew and downy mildew. So if you walk along the end of the rose, you can see, oh, my roses have got powdery mildew or they've got downy mildew, best I go out and spray my vines. And so that's originally why they're there. They're now done for pure decoration.
Adrian, can the spraying affect the characteristics of the wines that come up, or do they get properly washed?
Yeah, great question. The question was about the spraying and the chemicals that are actually put on, applied to the outside of the grapes to prevent those pests and diseases. The direct answer to it is there are withholding periods to say that we cannot pick those fruit within an applicated time. It doesn't go into the berry. It just goes onto the outside of the berry, and it will naturally. Most of the chemicals used are basically a little bit of sulphur and a little bit of copper, and that will naturally break down or wash off. They're such negligible amounts, and we're very responsible in Australia with the way we apply chemicals by and large, and so that we generally only use the absolute minimum amounts. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to those rules. What we find in really healthy vineyards that are well maintained and that have a good balance is the application of those chemicals just aren't required. Sorry, so you had a question?
In part that answered my question. Ask it fully. You mentioned about the different areas like the Adelaide Hills as opposed to the Barossa Valley or McLaren Vale producing different blends, if you like, of different grapes. Is that purely from soil type, or is it to do with weather conditions, or other factors?
Great question. The question was, what makes the distinction between the different regions and how does that show out through the fruit? What makes someone different from America, from Australia, from Argentina? Apart from accent. I don't have an accent, by the way. Not really, anyway. But the question is, I mean, that comes back to a nurture versus nature argument, to use psychology. So what makes the person, what makes the grapes? Is it the way that they're handled in the vineyard? Is it the quality of the vineyard manager? Or is it the area that they're growing in? And the answer is directly a bit of both. By and large, the grapes will reflect the area they're from, but also the viticultural practices that have been employed toward them. Okay, what we might do now is, has everyone had a chance to have a look at that wine? And were you able to see some of those characteristics that from the individual wines in the final wine? Bearing in mind that there's still that white wine in that wine. In that final wine, the white wine is still there. The white grapes are still there. Now I've actually got a couple of bottles of that Viognier down the back, and so that in this wine there are white grapes that have been fermented, and now that we've blended that wine and now that we've fermented that wine, it can't be separated. There is no chemical analysis I can do. There's no chemical process that I can do to separate that wine. It's a one wine now. It's been blended, and it contains those white grapes that, being in a red wine, really have no right to be there, but they are there, and I'm glad it's there because it adds to the overall complexity of the wine. Okay, what we might do is we might just clear away some glasses and let's share some communion, that common union that we have in juniors. That's in Greece. We prefer you not to splash them on the floor. They cost me $5. They cost me $5 a throw if any of them broken, which is okay. So, yes, absolutely. Feel free to use either the wine that's there. I've got some non-alcoholic wine for those who'd prefer to use non-alcoholic wine, and we've also got gluten-free crackers for those who'd prefer or are allergic to gluten.
Are we all wash them in the dishwasher?
No. Just, empty glasses can go upright back in these boxes on the top here. So make sure they're upright.
Because we can put them in the dishwasher.
It'll be easier to do, just take them all in their boxes, all in there. So the safest place for them is in the boxes.
can remember tomorrow, email me about those audios that you want, and I'll burn them to a CD.
I've already got them. I've already downloaded them.
Okay, anything else? Anything else that you're interested in, email me.
Okay.
And I'll put it on. Are you going to be here on Sunday night?
I'm hoping to be, yeah.
Okay. Well, just let me know.
Yeah, no
and
worries.
I'll get them off my hard disk.
Oh, that'd be great.
And just anything that you're interested in.
Yeah, no worries. There's
I might just give you admin access to the shop because I've shut the shop down because of problems.
Oh, some nutter crashed the system, did he?
No. We've got problems with the server. But no, I just want to give you a bit of liberty to
thank you.
Videos.
Yeah, it's mostly the MP3 stuff because I just listen to it over and over again. Well, it's just as I work.
Yeah.
So,
have you got a big picture?
Baxter gave me admin to his, or gave me unlimited access to his site. So, yeah, I think I've only listened to that twice. The Undoing of Adam.